Good afternoon and welcome. My name is Dr. Mary Walsh. I'm a faculty member in the counseling department at Boston College School of Education, and I'm also the director of the Center for Optimized Student Support. Our center is sponsoring this afternoon's module, a panel discussion, and we're the leading center nationally for improving the way that student support is delivered in public, charter, and private schools across the country. Our center also houses the City Connects intervention. The center provides cutting-edge research on what works and also best practices in student support for school practitioners, such as school counselors, school social workers, teachers, and principals. The COVID epidemic has made the need for student support glaringly obvious, and it has also challenged our traditional ways of providing it. In response, we see schools starting to shift in their approach to student support from a more traditional approach, responding to crisis and students with serious needs, to a more systemic approach, supporting the well-being of each and every student and providing them with tailored student support plans. Thank you for being with us this afternoon, and I'll turn it over to my colleague, Rebecca.
Hi, everyone. Thanks again for being here. We're so excited to have you for this panel. Just a few moments of housekeeping before we get to the main event. Just so you know, during this webinar, all attendees' cameras will be off and your microphones will be in the muted position throughout the session. This is just sort of for the standard format for a webinar. Although we'll be having a panel that has pre-scripted questions that we'll be asking and having our panelists answer, we will have an opportunity near the end of the session, the last 15 to 30 minutes, where you will be able to pose questions that we will ask on your behalf. Therefore, we'll be taking questions from you at the end of the panel, but use the Q&A function, as you can see kind of circled here in this icon, through Zoom to submit questions at any time. We'll be reminding you throughout that you're able to do this, but please, as questions arise for you or comments, send them along and we'll make sure to bring them up to our panel when we're at that point. Today's agenda, I just wanted to point out, is first we'll have a little bit of foundational comments from Pat DiNatale, who I'll soon introduce. Then we'll have our open panel discussion, which is around the 3 objectives that we posted when you signed up for this panel. And then we'll have that audience Q&A that I was just speaking of. You'll be able to submit your questions again through the Q&A Zoom function, and we'll take those and ask them on your behalf. Again, we're from 4 to 5:30, and we look forward to being with you for the next hour and a half. I'll now hand it over to Pat DiNatale, who is the Director of New Practice at the Center for Optimized Student Support here at Boston College. But of course, she also for many years was a teacher and principal in the Boston Public Schools, so brings tons of her school-based knowledge, and we're so lucky to have her. And then I'll pass it over to her. Pat, I think that you're muted.
Thank you, Rebecca, and thank you to all of you who have joined us this afternoon for this presentation and for the opportunity to not only listen about integrated student support and how that may serve as a framework for supporting students during this COVID crisis and certainly beyond, but also the opportunity to listen to 3 distinguished guests we have on our panel. So let me begin. As Dr. Walsh said, we're going to ground the work today inside schools and thinking of a framework, really how schools can support students and students' holistic development. So thinking about schools, there are really, in my opinion, 3 core functions for schooling. First of all, we know from the literature and we know from common sense that leadership matters, that having a strong school leader who understands how to move a school forward and understands each and every child and family in that school is critically important. We also know that teaching, learning, and assessment as delivered by classroom teachers is really the core of schooling. And yet we always have children who, when we think about them holistically and think about their development, we know that not every day, every single child comes into those classrooms with those really fine teachers ready to learn. So many schools have a student support process in place. In some schools, it may be your experience that student support really means folks on staff who are not necessarily in the classroom, school nurses, psychologists, counselors, social workers. In some schools, it's a structure, it's a team of professionals that can actually look at students and in many cases, taking a really close look at students who present significant risk. We're going to talk today about a student support structure that we call integrated student support. And if I could think with you for just a minute, if each one of you puts on your hat and says, here's my vision of student support. Some of us will be thinking about the professionals doing the work of student support. Some of us will be thinking about teams we sit on. Some of us will be thinking about what we bring as outside professionals to talk and support students. And sometimes we think about all of the things that are coming into a school that will support students. Rebecca, if you can advance the slide. All of these things at one point or another want to come into school and support students. We have health clinics, we have violence prevention programs, we have trauma-informed programs, social emotional learning, school safety. All of these programs, either through the school district, the school themselves, or an agency knocking on the door of a principal, wants to get into the school because they want to support students. All are critically important. And yet sometimes it can be chaotic for a school leader particularly, or even for a student support team in a school to make sense of all of this. So what we're going to be talking about today is how to take these really strong programs, how to take these professionals who do student support work and bring it into an integrated system of student support for each and every student. So if we look at that picture right in the middle of the screen, that's where we are. We're in the school, we're with the individual students, and we're going to think through what are all of those school-based supports that we have that we can think about to support individual students, not just students at risk, but all students. And we're going to take all those school-based supports and organize them into prevention supports, early intervention supports, and intensive services. We're going to do the same thing for all of those really active community partners that support the work of schools. And we're going to try to list all of the things they bring to a school and organize them into prevention and enrichment, early intervention, and for students in particular risk categories, intensive services. Sometimes we can think of this if you're in schools that have multi-tiered systems of support. Sometimes we can think of what are the prevention, early intervention, and intensive services, and how do we deliver those to students in a multi-tiered system of support. Next slide, Rebecca. So we're going to be thinking about, once we've organized all of our services and supports, how do we build an integrated student support system inside our schools? First of all, thinking about all students, that we want to build an integrated student support system in the school that addresses the strengths and needs of each and every student and builds a tailored plan for each and every student in the school. And in so doing, we want to take a whole child approach and not just look at that student academically, but how's that student doing social, emotional, behaviorally? What's the family dynamics? What's the physical health of the student? Thinking about things we know about developmental science that we can bring to a whole child approach. We also know that it has to be continuous for students. Students come in maybe at age 5 or 6. They stay with us till they're 13, 14, 15 and up. That student is always growing, always developing. So we want to be very current in our interaction with students, and we want it to be systemic. We want to be data-driven. So in thinking about an integrated system of student support, in summary, it's comprehensive, it's customized for the student, it's continuous, and it's systemic, it's data-driven. And in summary, it's how a whole child approach integrates individual student supports to improve outcomes for individual students. What we're all interested in is improving outcomes for students. Next slide, Rebecca. Now, Dr. Walsh said we're in the Center for Optimized Student Support. And one of the programs in the Center for Optimized Student Support is called City Connects. And many of you may have some connection to other types of integrated student support programs, and you may have brought them into your school. But I'm going to be talking about how City Connects has been working inside schools for 20 years now. It's a distinct program of integrated student support, and it has been evaluated on student outcomes. And what we see is this effective system of integrated student support brings forth higher academic performance for students. We see positive social emotional outcomes in schools, particularly this area of attendance. Children in a student support program such as City Connects has higher attendance rates as they're going through a system, going through the school system, and they move from grades 3 to 4 to 5 to 6. We're seeing higher statewide test scores. We're seeing lower rates of repeating in grade. We're seeing lower high school dropout rates. And we're seeing a student more likely to enter and complete post-secondary education. So having an integrated and effective system of student support can help us all along in our work in schools in order to support students. Next slide, Rebecca. So all of a sudden, over the last 10 months, we find ourselves in schools wondering what we're going to do now that students have been home for 10 months, have been in hybrid kinds of situations. We're actually now in an unprecedented public health crisis. It's coupled with the pandemic, and it's coupled with our focus now on institutional racism. How we respond to the effects of the pandemic and how we address longstanding equity issues is going to be critical for us as we think about bringing students back into school and supporting their academics, supporting their social emotional development, and supporting their behavior. I'm now going to introduce some panel members who are going to talk through this integrated student support idea with all of us because they have so many years of distinguished experience in this field. And we have a principal with us today, Edverette Brewster. He's the principal of the Holmes Innovation School within the Boston Public Schools. We have Ximena Soto with us today. And Ximena actually works in the social work office of the Boston College, and she works with the Latinx Leadership Initiative and brings really very, very well-trained social workers into some of your schools. And we have Ellen Winguard. Ellen's the program manager for City Connects and the director of student and family support for the Boston Public Schools. So welcome. So let me open with one question really for all of you. As each of you think about social workers, as you think about principals in schools or school counselors in a district role, how has integrated student support informed your work of developing the whole child? If you could each take a few minutes to think about in the role you're in now, how has integrated student support informed your work?
I'm happy to start.
Okay.
I think that overseeing our integrated student support framework in Salem has really informed a lot of other work happening in the district. When we think about student supports and we think about it in a broader perspective, when we think about the whole child, it really forces both a system and schools to be integrating and to be collaborating in all departments. And so when we ask questions that are thorough of the student, like, what's the family dynamic? How's the physical health? How do opportunities outside of school help impact student achievement? All of those questions really lead us into asking questions of our colleagues on how we're serving students. So it sort of de-silos what we do in schools. It breaks down those departments that traditionally happen in schools and says we all have to work together because it's the same kid. It's the whole child. So we can't take out what's happening academically from what's happening social emotionally or what's happening with the family or the health. That we all need to work together. And so it really forces a system from within because we start with the whole child.
Thanks, Ellen. Now, Ellen, by training, is actually a school counselor and is now leading the department over in the Salem Public Schools. And Ximena is actually training social workers at Boston College to go into schools and do some of this integrated student support work. How do you think about it, Ximena?
I think that the intersection of integrated school coordination speaks to the heart of social work. We are taught from the very beginning of social work that we have to understand all of the layers that impact an individual. And to me, this is exactly what Ellen, you're saying. We need to take into consideration the child's behavior, their learning, their development within school, but they don't exist just in school. They exist in the world. And so this integrated idea that takes in consideration not just the individual child, but the community of the school and how I think we have talked about it before about when you are one social worker and you are doing all of the crisis work, that is the power of one multiplied. And you can only, put a finger in each hole and there's 10 fingers and many more holes. And so I think that when you rely on your colleagues, when you really coordinate all of the development of that child, taking into consideration the family, all of your partners, all of your colleagues, then you're not just addressing the needs of one child, but you're addressing the needs of your community. And that to me is the core, because then that's a community that holds each and every single child.
Thank you, Ximena. Now, Edverette, we've been talking about integrated student support as a core function of schools and as a critical element of addressing strengths and needs of all children in the schools so that they can grow and thrive. And you have championed a system of integrated student support over at the Holmes. So how has this informed your work as a school leader?
I think there's the notion that like my primary concern should always be the academics, which of course, yes, we want the students to do well. MCAS is that, that word that's always flying around. So you want them to like, the scores to present itself. But one thing I have always believed as a teacher was that, the relationships matter. And that the root cause for students' academic performance or not performing where they could be oftentimes has nothing to do with the academics, but a lot of times has to do with the relationships and other outside factors. And so one of the ideas that the district has taken on, and we wholeheartedly believe here at the Holmes, is this idea of Maslow before Bloom. So I cannot engage in instruction if there are other outside forces. If my basic needs are not being met, then of course I'm not going to show up. And so for some students, what may be presented as behavioral issues might be that like, hey, I might be hungry, or I might want a shoulder to cry on. I may want to talk to someone. So I think that's important, particularly for our population, where the Homes like right now, I believe 44% of our students are on IEPs. And a lot of our students have been, what people have said at least, have been diagnosed as having emotional impairments. And I say that because, again, that is something that has been prescribed when in ideal, they just are, as kids will often tell me, I'm bad. I'm like, that doesn't make sense. You're just misunderstood. And so I think there are a lot of things that are in the way before we can even get to the academics. And so my goal is to mitigate all of those things and to make sure that like there aren't boundaries or hindrances that are impeding upon the instruction. I can do the instructional stuff all the time. I can coach, I can do all of that. But when we approach education, we often talk about it takes a village to raise a child. But in that village, no one was talking about what was happening in the classroom or the instruction. It was talking about the supports that it provides for those students. And so I think we have to address those things if we're going to do the instruction well.
How does it get actualized, Everett, at the Homes? All of the things you talked about, I think a lot of folks tuning in today can relate to. If they're in schools, they see so much of what comes into the school every single day and what children bring in to the school. So while your teachers are teaching, what's that structure that does all of the other things that you talked about?
Yeah, I think, well, one, we're super blessed because we do have City Connects here, but we also have a very robust student accountability team. And so that team functions of like being the mediator between a lot of times like student support issues and communication with families. But I will also say like setting the precedent this year and last year, like one of my biggest goals was family engagement. And so there has to be communication and a true partnership. I think last year was like, let's communicate with families, right? That was my first year here. But especially during COVID times, right? It wasn't just like talking to families. It was actually, we need to have a solid actual relationship. So this idea of like the two-way communication, actually understanding families. And so, for us, it was like, let's invite the families in and ask for feedback. So our families, one of our first PDs in the summer is actually having families come in and we do listening conferences. And so that means we're literally sitting back. We are not speaking, staff is learning because they are the true experts of students. And I often say like, yes, we're blessed to have our students for 7 to 8 hours a day, Monday through Friday, usually in a regular school year. But families have had them way before then and will have them after they leave us. And so it takes, we have to take from their knowledge and know-how. So that's the first step. And the other piece is as a staff, thinking about like how we show up. And everyone has a bias. I always say like, and the bad word privilege, like we all have it, right? The fact that I am on this call and I am a principal, whether it be because, despite the fact that I'm a Black man in America, I am where I am. So there's privilege there. And sometimes that power dynamic plays out in how, families interact with us. And a lot of times schools and districts will talk to parents and not talk with them. And then teachers in turn will talk to kids and not talk with them. Students always have a lot to say, but do we allow them the opportunity to share what they have and have their voices be heard? So like doing a lot of that work around equity, but then just thinking about the systems when those are in place is, as you know, our City Connects coordinator, Lexi, does like whole class reviews. And so we're able to kind of pinpoint where students might need the extra support. But again, that is done for every single child. And there's a big push on like identifying students, not only their areas of growth where they need support, where families need support, but what are their strengths? I think oftentimes when we're talking about children, we approach it in like a deficit mindset. Like, let's start with our kids who need the most support. Like, well, if we do everyone, you might find out that the students you thought were fine are not okay. And one of the activities that we actually had staff members go through was to look at a roster and name 2 facts about each of their students. It could not be academically related. You cannot tell me that Ellen reads at a level B. That's academically. I need you to tell me what her favorite color is or how many siblings she has. And I think one of the things that people often realize, even when I've done the exercise myself, those students that we perceive as doing well, we don't know much about. And so we're often losing out on the students because they're doing well academically, but they could be suffering in silence. And so everyone can benefit from some form of relationship. And so, yeah, we have the systems in place to support. We're in frequent communication. I wholeheartedly believe that there's a person who the staff members and we will share the load on that in that regard. And so there have been times where student support team member might respond to a student in crisis. And we're okay with being like, maybe I'm not the person for that student. There have been times in a meeting, I'm like, I have to go. My friend needs me. I have to be there because they're going to respond differently from me than they are from Pat. And so I think there has to be a level of trust also in the staff to know like who is the point person for that particular student. So that's kind of how like the systems and stuff work over here at the Holmes.
Thank you, Edverette. Thank you for being so candid in your description. I have a question for Ellen and for Ximena. How do you think about integrated student support as a lever for student achievement and for outcomes for students? You want to start, Ellen?
Sure. To what Everett was talking about and thinking about the strengths and needs of every student across, developmental domains. So thinking about drawing from students' strengths and gathering information and data on every student that points to their strengths and their needs really is the beginning point of that creating a tailored plan, a personalized plan for students. And from there, we can monitor and measure where students go on their path. And we can intervene when we need to intervene, and we can bolster where we need to bolster. We can, we can capitalize on the strengths that students bring to the table and highlight them and use them and showcase them and celebrate the rich resources that our students bring. So, I think about the systems, the integrated systems for student support and how we're gathering data. We monitor that student data. We can impact it when we need to, and we can follow it over time. And it's not just academic data. It's social, emotional, health, and family, which really
has it looked a little bit different now that we are living through a pandemic for so long?
Well, I think that there's time will tell a little bit about how it all pans out. I can say that having the systems in place to monitor students, to be thinking about every student, to have a way for teachers to talk about students' strengths and needs, we have a better handle on where students are. So, and what they need. We're not grasping at straws the way that some folks do, or they've been in the middle of the pandemic and they're not quite sure where to start. So, I think certainly we have families and students who are struggling with remote learning. We have students who are struggling with food insecurity or mental health issues as a result of COVID or increased isolation. So the integrated student support systems really help us to pinpoint where those needs are and then have a laser focus on where to deploy services, community partners, in district services, thinking about whose expertise we bring to the table. So I think, from a big picture, time will tell what the true impact is. What I can say is integrated student supports has helped us really address better knowing what the needs are.
Yeah, thanks, Ellen. Ximena, elaborate a little bit, since you're not working with folks who are doing the teaching and learning. And yet you're working with folks who are integral to a school. How do they advance achievement?
I go back to both what Everett and Ellen said. I think that to me, a core element of this whole thing is the level of trust that you're able to establish within your school between teachers, the coordinator, the knowing who that person is for that one child. I think that a social worker, a coordinator, whether it is that is sitting in a school, has to be at the center of all the trust that comes and goes out into the school. When we think of all of the different components that make up a school community, when you think of parents, teachers, nurses, and I think of some of the schools that we've worked with over time, and we knew the glue person, right? And that's the coordinator, that glue person that knows and trusts the community partners that are coming in, knows and knows not just the individual students, but their collective needs, right? That if there is a small group that is coming from a certain neighborhood and all of a sudden the numbers are spiking up with those kids, you might ask, what's going on in that neighborhood? What is happening that is impacting all of these kiddos that are coming in this week? Having the strong community partnerships that can inform that, having the internal trust with the teachers that they're not just going to send a child to your office to hang out and for you to deal with that child, but that there will be a communication and a team effort to say, you know, Joey was really struggling today and he was not able to sit for the lesson, and it was not like him. So we need to figure out. And then if you bring it to the next level of how a classroom is doing, and then if you bring it to the next level, I think that that's the important piece of what a coordinator can do, that they can have the pulse, not just the individual, but the collective and then the community. And
let me ask more, a little bit more. Since you're training new social workers, what's the difference of training a social worker who's going to go in and do clinical interventions, individual one-on-one therapy, versus somebody who's going to take this macro approach to what you're talking about?
Yeah. So I think that all social workers are trained to do two things: engage, assess, and treat. At which level you do that, I mean, those are the three core elements of our profession, right? Understand that person, engage them, know what are the key elements of that process. I was on a phone call this afternoon with a young lady who is a coordinator at one of the schools in Boston Public Schools. And she said that bridge with the families, I need to know who my families are. I need to know the healing bridge with some of them, and I need to know that some other ones are engaged just in a different, but I need to know them. I need to engage them. I need to assess what they need. And then I need to be able to treat. Some social workers want to treat clinically, like you said. I would put them on one end of the spectrum, that they say, I want to be a therapist. I am very comfortable going into a clinic and assessing, engaging, and treating individually. I think a good match for a school would be someone who sits in between the macro and the clinical. You have to have really good clinical skills to be able to engage and assess. Really good ones, because you have to know how to build that rapport and that trust with multiple players in the school setting. But then you've got to be able to know that you cannot do all that clinical work. Your client, your patient, is your community of the school. You're not just responsible for a caseload of 20. You are responsible for the health of that ecosystem that has many moving parts. That to me is the difference. You're using the same tool set, but you're using it at different levels of engagement and assessment.
So for each of you briefly, based on what you know about social workers, school counselors, administration of a school, what are the conditions that have to be present inside a school for a program to move forward like City Connects, a social worker to engage at the level of you were talking about, or as a principal, what are the conditions that have to be in place to have a structure that looks at children holistically? I don't know if you want to start, Edverette.
Sure. I was thinking about your piece around like the leadership, teaching, learning, assessment, and student support. I think there first has to be a belief by the leader and the leadership that it's worthwhile and important, and that the sole purpose is not just for us to quote unquote teach children, but also to provide incredible instructional opportunities for students, right? I think if you come in one-sided, only solely looking at the academics, then you lend way for other issues to arise, and for you not to totally see the children and what they are capable of, right? And so I think that's one of the places. I think you have to start with a mindset, but I also think there has to be systems in place for you to monitor and to check in. So, you know, we do have City Connects, but we have an entire student support team. And so what that looks like is each of those of our student support team members are attached to grade levels. And so one of the things that's like COVID arose and just making sure that there was like checks and balances is making sure that like there is space and opportunity to address student concerns. And so during our common planning time, like reserving time every week for student support team members to check in, right, and say, hey, who have we not been in contact with? Who you have concerns with, and then following up with that the next week. And so it's not just coming from like, common planning time is just for us to talk about instruction, but we have to kind of put our money where our mouth is and actually like reserve that time to like check in and to have those conversations. The other piece is making sure that teachers can then provide, you know, evidence of progress in the upcoming weeks, or if they have concerns about particular students, there's a student support team and a whole process. I think one of the things that we've definitely noticed is that a lot of times that idea of like, well, a student is struggling, IEP, like, wait a minute, whoa, all right, there's overrepresentation of, you know, students of color, particularly Black and brown boys when it comes to IEP. So like having that process to go through, it might be some suggestions that we could do to prevent that. Like as a teacher, I know that there were certain students who, if I had listened to the teacher before me about what that student was capable of or who they were, then I would never have given them a chance. And so a lot of times, again, it goes back to the relationship piece, that students did perfectly fine in my class that other teachers, if they had followed that role and that path based on their academics, would have assumed that they would have best been fit for an IEP when that wasn't the case. And so I think having those systems in place allow us to, one, check ourselves around biases, move the needle toward more equitable practices. And I think, you know, it's better off in supporting the student overall. And those are the things that I like come to mind automatically for me.
Ellen, what about you? You're bringing in programs into schools. You're not only bringing in a coordinator to implement a practice, you're bringing programs in to support students, and you're bringing partners in to support students. What are the conditions that a school has to have in place to engage with all of this in a positive way?
I'm going to double down on what Edward already said around leadership, and I'm going to say, in addition to mindset, I think leaders need to also be able to articulate why. So I think we have, you know, I don't think that you rise to the level of principalship or assistant principalship or anything without really caring about the whole child. I don't think that that's possible anymore. But the why, I think, is really important for leaders to articulate, because when push comes to shove, moving back into traditional ways of student support is really easy to do. And so you need leaders to be able to say, we do this because, and then be able to list out all the reasons. So, we do this because we know we need to think about the opportunity gap, because we know we need to look at equity, because all of the different sort of why, and be explicit about it, because integrated student supports takes time, and time is money. And so we really need to make sure that we not only put our money where our mouth is, but understand and articulate for everybody around us why we're doing it. I think the structures that Everett talked about are really, really important, keeping true and being able to look at them and reflect on them and improve on them, sort of always a growth mindset. How can we keep getting better at this? And then finally, I would say, you need to make sure you have some expertise at the table. You can't just put a random bunch of people at the table and expect student supports to be great. And so we really have to be thinking about both the agency of the folks who are at the table coordinating student support, so their ability to move work and their belief that they can move work, and the leadership's support of that. But also there are other folks in the building that coordinator or that student support hub needs to be able to lean on. So they may not be the expert at academic interventions, but there needs to be somebody at the table who does and knows it well and thoroughly, so that there's confidence in the process.
Thank you. And I'm going to ask the same question, Ximena, in a little bit of a different way. You're bringing a social worker into a school. There are 300 students in the school. What are the conditions for that social worker to be successful? What are the conditions that a school should have in place?
So I'm going to triple down on what both of my colleagues have said. It does come down to leadership, and I'm going to add a little bit of a twist to it, because that leadership needs to know that role and imagine that role and that coordinating role, versus I just need someone to take care of this problem on the side. That vision, that allowance of shared power and vision. That person has to have, like Ellen said, some agency to make things happen. There needs to be a lot of trust in those relationships. And I will say that one element that I would absolutely have to voice out is flexibility is a key component for schools that are going to make this work. Flexibility in how we share space with programs that may come in. Flexibility in our roles, that sometimes we are going to have to support kids in ways that we are not, hired to do, but that is the right thing to do for that child in that moment, because you are their person with the support of your team. So that flexibility, that shared vision, and a collaborative spirit among all of the professionals that are at the table, that regardless of their role, they're there for the whole child, and that they know that their role is a key element to the success of that child and of the whole community. I keep thinking of COVID, and Ellen, you had said, places that had systems in place before COVID hit were able to fall back on those systems, and that trust that existed between families and the school, that has been a key element to communities that have been able to support those learners. If you had solid community partnerships already in existence, those are now looking different, but they may be flourishing in a radically different way. If you already had a way of tracking your kids and how they were doing, you're able to see the waves of like, which ones are the kids that are actually doing really well with the online instruction? What do we learn from them? What's working for them? Who are the kids that disappeared? And who are we going to get to help us to find those kids that seem to be lost and no one seems to be able to track them? So I think that flexibility, that shared vision, and that shared ownership of this work, it needs to be a team effort, because it cannot just be one person trying to coordinate, because again, that's just the power of one.
What about having a model of student support? You're all talking about teams and relationships and how we look at students. And I think you're supporting the fact that student support is for each and every student, not just students at risk. But how do you get that work done, Ellen?
For all students.
Yeah.
Well, all students walk in the building in normal times. They all walk in the building, so they're all ours. And when we think of all means all, we have to be able to put systems in place to be thinking about every student and what they bring forward. I think we have this myth that whatever happens in the classroom is what shapes a student's experience, and we need to debunk that myth. Students bring in a wealth of knowledge, information, culture, sometimes hurt, sometimes anger, sometimes all the things that, sadness, whatever. And so we have to acknowledge that and co-construct communities in our schools that reflect our kids' experiences. We have to create narratives with each other as opposed to assuming what a student's narrative is when they come in and then wiping the slate clean and saying, okay, now whatever I put into your brain in math is going to come out as math. So we have to have systems that think about every single student, and all parts of their life. We know that what happens from 3 p.m. to 8 a.m. or 4 p.m. in Everett's school to 8 a.m., means a big deal with student achievement. So we have to think about what students bring into their classroom and help them be able to feel like school is a place where they can flourish.
And Ellen, you have responsibility for that whole realm of student support among 8 schools, 9 schools in Salem. What's your view of how student support is rolled out in each of these schools? Should it be a defined practice? Should it be every school does their own thing? We see a lot of different things in schools. Sometimes you can walk into one school and you see student support moving in one direction. You walk into another school in the same district and it's moving in a different direction, where, we know from teaching and learning that we're trying to bring some evidence-based kind of approaches to the way we teach reading, the way we teach mathematics. How does student support fit into that?
I think your first sort of part of the question around, do districts sort of adopt a framework for student support, or do we really ask principals to think about what they want in their buildings? I think there's, I think that there's a both and. I think that there is. I don't think it has to be one way or the other. I think, and I have the luxury of being in a small, urban, really cool district in the North Shore of Massachusetts. We have an amazing demographic of students, and it's really it's a lovely place to both live and work. And I think that while schools like to have their sort of individuality, their own ability to put their sort of stamp of who they are on, and their own path, there is really power in being able to move a district having consistent frameworks. And I think within those frameworks, you need to have some flexibility for those school cultures to come through. But when I've had the opportunity to sort of germinate and build a team across Salem that's been really powerful, that students now can go from, pre-K through 8th grade, having sort of a network of support. And that includes community partners, that includes, cadre of school counselors and coordinators. And that, that can be really, that can hold students in a way that, that when you do your own thing in every single building, you can really have kids sort of fall through the cracks. So I think that there is place for both a consistent framework and structure, with buildings being able to, schools being able to put their own, culture forward.
Thank you. Going back to that slide where we went from the chaos slide, we call it, where so many things are trying to come into a school, all good things for students. And we try to organize them in a way that are school-based services, community-based services. Each one of you has talked about engaging with the community, engaging with community-based agencies in order to tailor services for students. So how do you think about, Everett, how do you think about engaging with community-based agencies so that services are tailored for your children?
So coming in, one of the things that we took some time doing in the summer, because again, my first year was a great year to become a principal because we had a whole pandemic. So I still don't know what a typical year looks like, but we did do some work in the summer of 2019, and we laid out our priorities for the year. And so what we kind of did was like, all right, if it doesn't fit here, we're not doing it. So it kind of like allowed us to keep out the noise. So if it doesn't align to what we're doing here, it doesn't fit, and that's okay. And we will be fine. And I think because of that, we've kind of aligned the things that we are doing, and like maintain partnerships that did align, adjust if it did not, and be okay with that. And I think by like grounding in that way, we were able to rely on those same community partners throughout the pandemic. And so like being very intentional about like who you are working with, because again, quality over quantity. And so those are the same partnerships that have been extremely helpful and were extremely helpful in the spring. And, you know, just by like working with certain agencies, we kind of get connected to other agencies that are like aligned to our mission, aligned to our vision, and know the population of students that we serve, and have been extremely helpful in helping us mitigate, you know, what students need. So like one that comes to mind is our like Girls Inc., which was a new partner last year. And, you know, still having our young ladies work with Ivana, like in the, you know, despite during the pandemic, they still wanted to meet. And so like, you know, once it launched here in the school, you know, I'm gonna sneak in and go, you know, say hi. And they're looking at me like, why are you here? This is not your space. I'm like, all right, fine. So like having a culture, but making sure, because then, you know, our young men are like, wait a minute, what about us? Making sure there's a balance in that regard. But one of the things that I did jot down was thinking about, you know, our approach to like student support. When sitting through, I think I had a meeting with our director of operations, who was amazing. And we were thinking about like, okay, what do we need to do? And we're thinking about how we support students. And one of the questions that came to mind was, when we're supporting, is the support necessary because the student needs it, or is it because the family needs it, right? And so like, we have to like change that mindset and thinking, especially now. So we've had families like, hey, I know they need to log in, but this is very difficult for me. We've had families, because again, the relationship is important. It's like, hey, I am battling with depression myself. And so as a result, my child is suffering. And so a lot of times, if we don't have that rapport, if we're not having that wraparound services, if we're not thinking about like the entire child, we can often get lost in the sauce, right? And so we don't have the full picture. And I think that was one of the things that we definitely had to rethink and think about as we're like providing support. And the other piece was, you know, if I think someone mentioned like, are the students logging in? Who have we lost? Who is not logging in? Who isn't engaged, right? Because there's a whole nother facet of like, students are logging in, but they're not engaging in the work. And so one of the other questions that I often pose is like, is it a result of COVID? Is it a result of quarantine? Or is it a result of just showing up differently? Were the students actually engaged when they were in your class last year in person? Or are you just noticing it now because the screens are black? Right? And so like there's, you know, the multi-level and thinking about, to your point again, you have to think about the student support piece. You have to think about the leadership and like who is at the table. I definitely appreciate that. So like having instructional coaches at the table is just as important as having our student support team, our student accountability team. And so making space, which is one of the other things that we did, was like every 2 weeks, we're making space for all of us to sit at the table, because there might be something that we're missing. If my purpose or the lens that I'm looking at something is through the lens of instruction, then that's where my mind is going to go. And so it's important for us to like see and come and meet together so that we're powerful and more and better and stronger as a result. And I think that kind of filters into who we work with in the community, and better understand the supports that the students need in our school.
Thank you. I'm so mindful of the time, and I don't want us to leave the three of you without getting back to that whole question about equity and equality of opportunity. So with your own definition or understanding of equity, how does an integrated student support system contribute to equity of opportunity and student outcomes?
So I would say that when I hear you speaking about your students, the question arises, are my students known? Do my students feel known and loved, right? And I think that to me is a large part of the equity. Do I know what the student needs? Am I paying attention to their cues? Am I paying attention to their needs? And I think that when you don't just say every student needs X, Y, and Z, and if they don't fit into this little box of the things that I have predetermined are all the things that every child needs, regardless of whether they impact you or not, then kids start falling through the cracks. I think that to answer both the question that you answered before and this particular question, I think the power of data, of tracking of how each individual kid is doing, but also how the community is doing, that if you see that only 3 students need this particular service, it may not make sense to partner up with an organization that comes in and takes up a lot of space and time for only 3 kid participants. You may look at that partnership differently. But if you see that your whole community of children need a particular thing, then you know by the data and not just by your hunch or by your bias or by your preconception of what is needed, you are addressing that particular need at that particular developmental moment of that child to make sure that they don't miss out on all of the things that the school has to offer. That to me is equity.
What do you think, Ellen?
Yes, all of it. The only thing that I would add is that, to me, the definition of equity is when students and families and people get what they need. Not everything is equal, right? And so you have to have a system by which you understand what students need on a very sort of individualized way, and it has to cover all the things that happen in a student's life, not just how they do on a reading assessment. It's got to cover all the things that happen outside of school as well, so that we can think about who has opportunity and who doesn't, and start to break down some of those systems that have caused these inequities. We have to make sure that we're partnering with the right folks. I think Edverette said it earlier. I think we have to be also honest about what schools can do and what they can't do. There's a level of expertise that our community partners have. They have capacity to do things that, frankly, we just aren't able to do in schools. And so if we have a system in place to be able to really optimize what's all around us, then we can, in schools, think about sort of evening out the playing field a bit. Lifelong work, for sure.
Lifelong work, for sure. Edverette, your thoughts?
I would second and third everything that has already been said, especially the piece of everyone gets what they need, and kind of tailoring that approach so that everyone is set up for success. And so what I need may look very different, and I think not only the knowledge but the know-how and the connections to make that happen. Other than that, I wholeheartedly agree. Lifelong
work for all of us. I'm going to turn it over to Rebecca, because those of you who have been listening in on this discussion may have some questions that you'd like to ask the panelists. Rebecca?
All right. Hi there, everyone. Thank you for your answers to the questions that we've written before. And now thank you all for submitting your questions to our Q&A. We have a bunch, so we're going to start with one that asks, this is specifically to Everett, but please, anyone, answer this. One of our attendees asked, you've mentioned a couple of times summer PD for all staff. How have you been able to shift your PD to focus on integrated student supports when there are generally so many other competing things to do PD on?
Oh yay, PD. I love PD, but I think one of the things is kind of like coming in, I intentionally, actually, the very first year, so last year, because there's only 2 of them, I intentionally did not touch instruction until the end. So like our last 2 days were around instruction. The first day was like building the container, is what I called it. So like getting to know each other, because you can't work well together if there's no level of trust. One of the days was also solely dedicated to family engagement and student support. And then in that regard, we also had our community partners. I saw another question was like, who are some of your community members? So I don't think our staff even knows, like it wasn't very clear, like who are our community partners? And so we literally just take each day to focus solely on those things, because I think if you set the precedent that this is important, it goes a long way. So I was very intentional about saying like, okay, I know you teach, great. Instruction, awesome. And I think there was a big focus on instruction, especially coming in. So I was like, I don't think that's where we need to focus our attention, because I think we're doing a pretty okay job with that. But let's take a look at like the other pieces that are going to make the instruction even better, whether you see the direct connection. And so I think to answer that question, like having our community partners come in and set up tables, and our teachers could actually, and staff members could go around and talk with them to better understand like, wait, oh, I can reach out to you if this is coming up. Some of those programs are Rosie's Place, Girls Inc., Cradles to Crayons. We have a governing board, and so utilizing our community members in those connections as well. Excellence for All, which is a program through Boston Public Schools. Children's Services of Roxbury. So a lot of our families have family partners, but also Children's Services of Roxbury will come to the school in a regular time and actually do counseling services. So like that was something that was super important. And then of course, City Connects. So those are some of those partners.
I can ask the next question unless Ellen or Ximena you'd like to contribute.
I would just say that it goes back to leadership. And Everett, that was your vision, and you needed to build that trust, and you needed to get everyone moving in the same direction, understanding that their instruction was going to be strengthened by the ability of children being able to receive it.
Wonderful, thank you. We had a question about who some of your community partners are, and you've actually begun to list them. So as a tag on to that question, we have another one that asks, how have you seen partnerships with community agencies and schools change during the pandemic? And how do you think they'll continue to change?
In Salem, we have a lot. Our community partners are at the ready. They really, one of the reasons why City Connects and Integrated Student Supports came into Salem was we needed a way to identify being able to partner with our community organizations better. And so, because we have folks like the Salem YMCA, Leap for Education, Boys and Girls Club, we have North Shore Behavioral Health Services. They have always been at the table from the moment we closed schools to try and figure out how do we make sure kids are okay. And so over the last year, they've shifted to things like emergency childcare if needed. They've helped us build what we were calling hub extensions, which were learning pods inside of our schools that were facilitated by community partners, ultimately childcare, but through community partnership. So, obviously a lot of our mental health services went to telehealth, which the silver lining on that is that access became easier. Spots opened up, families were able to participate, parents were able to participate in family sessions. There was some language accessibility that also came into play. So, I do hope going forward that continues to be a model, not the entire package, but, a model for families that really benefit from not needing or being able to get in a car and go to a clinic.
Yeah.
Those are the ways that we've seen so far.
And I would say that a silver lining, if there are any within COVID, is I think people were amazed at how much schools do. Just as a system, schools have become the main providers of food safety, food security, childcare, instruction, access to services. And I think that people realizing the disconnect and the lack of communication that existed among all these different things have all of a sudden pulled us together, because food security became an issue for our community and not just the schools to advocate on behalf of their kids. All of the sudden, mental health became a community issue. And I think that there have been many innovative ways of, like Ellen said, of just how do we do this? How do we reach people? How do we collaborate with the Boston Police Department to be able to figure out what's going in communities? How do we figure out how to work with the collaborative to be able to deliver food? And being really creative and an elevated level of partnership to make sure that our communities were taken care of and not just the kids in our building.
We have a couple follow-up questions that are in a similar vein, asking one, we actually have some community partners on the call right now asking, well, what can we do to best support your students, your families, your schools? And then a kind of adjacent question we've gotten is, what are some ways that community agencies can foster better partnerships with schools and districts? So kind of similar questions there.
I can certainly say that just recently, this past Monday, I facilitate a monthly meeting with our student support coordinators, and the executive director of the YMCA asked to meet with us just to check in, just to say hello, to understand that there's always moving pieces right now, and that everyone's trying to be as flexible as possible, but to be just sort of open, create an open dialogue. To be as responsive as possible. So I think that alone provides a venue for, partnership, sort of collaboration. We're in this together, and if there's anything that comes up that we need to strategize around, we take care of it quickly, as opposed to letting things sort of fester when we don't understand each other's, lingo. So I think that is that's one sort of on the ground way of thinking about it. But I do know that. It can't be, schools and community partners are, again, looking at the same kids. They're supporting the same student. And so any way that you can create those two-way conversations about the students, making sure that families feel like they know they've got a system at play and not just a whole bunch of people that they have to navigate, has also sort of been helpful in us in addressing some of the most recent concerns around all the things that families are facing.
All right, should I ask the next one? I want to give space for you to answer questions and not cut you off. All right, let's go to our next one. There's a question about how social work students who really want to get involved in work in schools, specifically work in integrated student support approaches, how could they get started doing this? We have this City Connects venue, but I think the question is kind of broader. How do we begin?
I think it depends on the school system that you're working in and their ethos and their approach to this, right? Because you could go into Salem and all of a sudden realize that there is an opportunity because that's the thinking and the ethos around student support. I do think that there, like Pat said at the beginning, there are different structures of student support that exist already in every school. It may be something not as dynamic and integrated as this, but finding out about the different models and the best practices, if you're on this call, now you know. Find out a little information. Definitely, when you're looking for field placements and places of practice, talk to the people that are helping you find your placement and practicums to be able to put you in a place where there is a social worker that approaches the work this way and not just that is going to utilize you. Redefining your goals as a social worker, knowing that you want to practice at that meso level, having really strong social work skills, but using them not for counseling, not for the therapeutic element of it, but for the systems change and the system intervention that you want to do.
All right, our next question is kind of a more technical one, is how do school budgets lend themselves to the continuation of integrated student supports, both through staffing as well as through partnerships? So we have our panelists, but Pat might also be able to contribute here as a former school leader.
I'm definitely going to leave that to Edverette and Ellen because I haven't had to deal with school budgets for several years now and not missing it.
Yeah, yeah. I figured I kind of know who probably sent this question. With that being said, yeah, no, not always. I think one of the things when we're talking about equity, and this is something that I've actually like raised, is that the way that funding usually works is that it is tied to enrollment. And the way that enrollment works is, you know, if enrollment declines for whatever reason, then there goes funding as well. And so there are some shifts. So in naming some of our partners, I had to like leave off a name because of funding, we can no longer partner anymore. And so like that's some of the heavy toll of like with partnerships, right? Is that sometimes those partnerships cost money. And while we would love to continue the partnership, when we're like trying to balance and keep things as consistent as possible for students, that's where my mind often goes when making budgetary decisions. Is I'm gonna always think about the students first. That's it. That is number one. And then trying to make sure that their experiences are as similar as possible. And so in thinking about, you know, sometimes it would be kind of creative around like some of the approaches and like how you can maintain some of the things. And so I think by approaching budget in one, keeping kids centered, but also keeping our priorities the priorities. I enter budget meetings and those spaces with first saying like, hello, here's a little bit about my community. Here are our priorities. And this is how I'm going to shape all of the things and all of the decisions. And so trying to meet in the middle somewhere and keeping the main thing. And so no, it doesn't always lend itself to like keeping things the exact same, but I think having those conversations with whoever is at the table, whether it be the governing board when having those conversations, and sometimes tough conversations around like, what are we going to do? I think if we, you know, keep it fostered and centered around our priorities, our mission and vision, that's how I kind of make those decisions and kind of navigate that. Is it tough? I know Pat knows. Absolutely. January is a treacherous time. But I think that's what keeps me grounded and, you know, trying to negotiate those things.
Yeah, I mean, I would agree that again, I go back to making sure you're very clear with why, and then the impact and outcomes you expect to see as a result of this investment. So having a really clear path and an understanding of why you're investing in resources for integrated student supports, the outcomes you expect to see, whether it be through data or other culture change. And then, you know, really thinking very clearly about where the work gets done and how to do it efficiently. So, you know, thinking about everybody's role in the building and where you're going to ensure, you know, who sort of takes responsibility for that work. You got to map it out, and you got to think critically about where's your return, you know, where are you going to get the best return on investment.
In some ways, my experience in working with folks at Boston College to put City Connects on the ground was really, in one way, from a financial perspective, because often schools will try to hire one person, you know, a single social worker, a single school counselor, 300 students. And then all of us know that particular staff member cannot meet all of the needs that we just talked about. Each and every student across developmental domains, gathering community partners, tailoring services, being on top of working with families. So is there a way for that person to really be that hub of student support and leverage the services from the community and leverage services from outside the school so that we're bringing more services in for students? I mean, that was one of the things that we thought through, because there's never enough in the school budget to do what needs to be done.
And I would even venture to say that it shouldn't all be done in the school building.
Sure thing.
These kids belong to a lot of the communities that we work with. And so in order for them to continue to thrive as human beings, as whole children, they need to be able to thrive in different spaces that call for them to do different things. And so I think to that question of how we can become, better partners, I think that communication, Ellen, that you were talking about, of just what are we seeing in school, what are we seeing in the community, and how do we hold those young people, those children within that community? How do they belong to all of us, right? And yeah, there's limited space and time and budget in the school, but that can be multiplied widely if you have partners in the community who can provide after school, who can provide counseling, who can provide mentorship, family support. And I think that is the key element. It cannot all happen in the school building.
Thank you. I think we have time for one final question. And we have a question here about data, asking what data do you think is critical to look at? And, some other things that were thrown out there, attendance, academic data, grades, test scores, but we're talking about a lot of developmental domains here. What do you see as the crucial data or information that would help inform these processes?
This is just a problem with practice. So this is my mind. I started smiling. I was like, attendance. That's like one of the things. And I think with attendance comes some like nuance. So like absolutely thinking about, because we have like survey data. And one of the things we just looked at was kind of triangulating the survey data from our stakeholders. So like, what are the experiences of our students based off of their survey data versus our teaching staff versus our families. And so I think that was eye-opening because we're talking about equity, right? And I think our staff is like, equity, yeah, we're doing the work because we're doing it every week. It isn't just and that was one of my goals this year. We're not gonna do that equity PD that we do that one time and then everything else is gonna be about instruction. We need to weave it into everything that we do, but it's not trickling down. So like kids are like, equity, talking about race, maybe we do that sometimes. And families are like, maybe they do it or not. And so I think without that data, we wouldn't have known. And so I think just as important as the quantitative data is the qualitative data. So having conversations with stakeholders. And I will often say, I've said it when I sat in my interview to be the principal here, we often make decisions about students without including students and their voices in the decisions. They have a lot to say, but very few times are they allowed to sit at the table or to share that information. So I would say I'm very, very big on like narratives and having those conversations with folks. Of course, I'm going to look at reading levels and grades and MCAS scores, absolutely. But I think just as important are the experiences of our key stakeholders involved.
All right. We want to thank our panelists so much. We just have a few more details to wrap up before we send you off for the rest of your evening. So I'm just going to share my screen again here. So as we're kind of moving forward and thinking about our integrated student support work, we want to invite you to join us on our 3-part workshop series that will be coming up this spring. There will be 3 sessions. One will be on thinking about leveraging systems of student support to promote holistic development, kind of what we've been talking about here. Then a hands-on workshop to develop practical ways for understanding and addressing students' holistic development. And then a 3rd session in which we'll actually have a peer collaboration session to think about what you're doing and how we can move it forward even more. So really related to the thinking that's been doing on this panel, a really more hands-on experience. My colleague Ryan Hand is going to drop a link into the chat that'll allow you to click to find more information, enroll if you see fit. We really think this is for K-8 folks who are on student support staff, but it's really open to anyone. We also want to invite you to stay connected with us through social media, through our blogs, through our websites, etc. We hope this is just the beginning of a relationship together. And most of all, we really want to thank you and our panelists for such a robust conversation, for really spending the time with us to really think about how we can support students during this time, during this difficult time and beyond. And we hope to see you again soon.